Hello, I'm Helen Steers, and I'm a partner at Pantheon, and I'm the senior manager responsible for Pantheon International Plc. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Rini Banerjee, who is the senior legal counsel at Index Ventures. She's been at Index actually since 2014. She helps both Index and the founders and the portfolio companies with all the standard legal issues, but really importantly, she's also responsible for ESG, and that is the subject of today's discussion. So Rini, lovely to have you with us. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Helen. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to talk about Index's ESG strategy and policy today.
So Rini, please could you give us a brief overview of Index Ventures, focusing on Index's investment strategy, the geographies it invests in, and the sectors of interest?
So Index Ventures is a global venture capital fund, and we invest primarily in North America, Europe, Israel, and Australia, but we've been known to make opportunistic investments in other jurisdictions as well. Our primary sectors of focus are three buckets. So first, fintech and financial services. Second, new consumer and interests in new consumer activities. And third, enterprise infrastructure. So we have multi-stage from seed to growth, and primarily focused on these sectors.
Thanks very much, Rini. Now turning to ESG, investors are increasingly focusing on venture capital funds that actively consider ESG when making investment decisions. Now, we've been invested with Index for a long time, and we know that you've been taking ESG factors into consideration for some time. But you've recently consolidated your existing frameworks and you launched your formalised ESG policy in the Q3 of 2020. So what are the fundamental principles and what has been the initial reaction from your investors and from the portfolio companies?
We've always had at Index is what we call a smell test. So we've always had an ESG principle and value within the firm, but what I just did was bring them all together into a formalized policy. So right from when Index first started, it's always been about leaving the world a better place than when we first came into, and that's been our thesis ever since we started investing. Last year, we put all of them together by actually reaching out to all of our limited partners who were very instrumental in giving us feedback on our ESG policy, and in terms of also looking at what other competitors are doing, because unlike private equity or public institutions, ESG in a VC industry has to be more tailored and more suited. So that was sort of our main guiding principle with getting all of the policy together and consolidating what was already an existing principle behind Index's investment thesis. So with that, there were lots of factors to think about in terms of, feedback from our portfolio companies, because one thing we noticed was that there was a divergence in tendencies between the US and Europe. And as I mentioned, we're a multi-stage, multi-geography fund, so we want to make the same ESG strategy for Europe as we would for the US, but there are conflicting tensions. So one of the things I was concerned about particularly was if you're doing ESG due diligence in a US company that's not perhaps used to thinking about ESG in the same way as a European company, what would the feedback be? Because our primary role is still to get into the best tech investments across the world. So those were some sort of challenging issues that we wanted to solve. And we think we've come to a good place because we launched our policy and we launched our ESG due diligence framework last year. And the feedback across the pond, across all our stages has been very, very positive. So some portfolio companies have said that they're so happy to have an investor that is interested in environmental, social, and governance and is asking the right questions at the investment stage. So in terms of portfolio companies, we maintain our thesis of finding the right tech companies, the best tech companies, but at the same time, we don't enforce any reporting covenants, or we don't ask our portfolio companies to produce KPIs or any other forms, but we want to work with them and collaborate with them to improve ESG standards and to improve diversity standards and to improve environmental standards. So we've taken this lens of collaboration and cooperation, and it is hopefully when we exit these companies, we'll see a very positive return for this work. And with respect to the question around the limited partner feedback, so as with Pantheon, most of our limited partners are extremely happy about this. So we feel that we have sufficiently satisfied our limited partners' concerns, but we see ESG as something that is going to continuously evolve and change as we see more scientific research, as socioeconomic conditions change. So we see our ESG strategy as something that, again, we work in close cooperation with our limited partners to continue to evolve and refine.
Thanks very much, Rini. I think we all agree there are opportunities as well as risks when looking at ESG. But what are the framework and systems that you put in place to actively identify and monitor the ESG risks in your portfolio companies?
Yeah, I think that's basically the heart of ESG monitoring and tracking. And the way we did it, and it's also related to how I work at Index, where I also do deals. So every single deal is sent to the legal team. So we always have a primary check at the point of conception of an idea. Should we invest in this company? And as you know, we have restrictions in our limited partnership agreements on where we can and cannot invest. So if somebody would present a thesis that relates to, for example, cluster munitions or arms or weapons, instantly we know that this isn't within the thesis of our fund, and this is not within our ESG principles. So already at the conception stage, we have a way to track and we have a way to monitor whether or not it fits within our limited partners' restrictions. Once we've decided to invest, we do ESG diligence in certain companies. So this is our ESG diligence framework that we use. So we speak to our portfolio company, we ask them both open-ended and specific questions around how they're thinking about toxic waste, for example, or supply chain, or what is their diversity at the board level look like, whether they have whistleblowing policies. So we have a list of questions that we tailor to each company, and we do ESG diligence alongside legal diligence. So things like data protection, which many LPs think comes within ESG, but we've always seen it as part of legal due diligence and have been doing that since we started. So this ESG diligence is on top of legal diligence, or on top of background checks, or on top of other financial due diligence that we do. So this sits alongside other streams. To date, we have not found any red flags in our ESG due diligence, but if we were to find red flags, we would highlight that risk appropriately, and we would decide whether we suspend the investment, modify the investment, or otherwise, cancel the investment or tailor it. So we would use the results of ESG diligence in the same way that we would for financial diligence, adjust valuation or impose post-closing conditions. So that is our plan to deal with risks going forward. But as I mentioned, no red flags so far. Then we get to the stage of, actively being on boards of the company or on what happens post-investment, because they start becoming part of our portfolio. So I think one critical distinction, again, compared to sort of private equity houses or other public markets, is that we always take minority stakes. So we never have, joint venture or control of a company. So when we take board seats, it's in a non-executive role. So it's more, let's influence standards and let's change how they're thinking about perhaps diversity. So what we've done, for example, in a couple of our companies is that when there are new investors joining the round and the board expands, we prompt the company to think about hiring a diverse candidate. So we do that both in terms of, what's best for the company, but also guided by the ESG principles that we have. So we've tried that, we've done that successfully and helped our portfolio companies think about these issues. Secondly, apart from just sort of soft influencing and making these changes, we also ask our investment team person who is on the board or responsible for the investment to let us know of ESG developments. So internally, we have a Slack channel where the whole firm participates and shares news and updates. So we talk about ESG developments in our portfolio, ESG developments at Index, and sort of other ESG initiatives. And we use that to form our ESG newsletter, which we share with our advisory board once a year. And we also use that to report to our limited partners as part of our end of year reports. So that is how we are tracking both positive and negative developments within the portfolio.
Thanks, Rini. Now moving on to the COVID-19 pandemic. How has this impacted your investors' focus on ESG? And are there any issues that investors were not really focused on before that the pandemic has brought to the forefront?
Yeah, so I think to be perfectly honest, the main focus that our investors had with coronavirus was around valuation and whether there were any write-offs or any adjustments we needed to make to the valuation. With respect to ESG, a few of our limited partners actually produced a document on how managers and how the industry should be facing and responding to coronavirus. So we adopted those principles. So one of the principles was make sure that all your regular suppliers are still being paid during lockdown. So we actually did that. And actually these flowers are from our florists. So we try to keep maintaining our good relationships with our suppliers and communities. So that is on the index side in terms of responding to LP demand. In terms of our portfolio, our primary investments are in tech. So actually moving to a full remote moving doesn't affect our industry as much as, high street industries. One thing that we noticed a lot in our portfolio companies was how they were trying to bring people together. So I won't take any names for confidentiality reasons, but one of our portfolio companies, for example, is a transportation and ride sharing provider. And they actually create this new application that people could download, and 20,000 people downloaded it, and people helped their neighbors or people sheltering in place or vulnerable people in their community with groceries and with making sure that they got their medicines or could do their pickup. So even though we were in this sort of unprecedented time of, loneliness or withdrawing within ourselves, we really saw our portfolio companies take initiative to solve these social problems and to help in a way that no one was telling them to go do it. They just saw an opportunity and seized it to help their communities. So there are many, many examples like that in our portfolio. We have another company that is helping people who've lost their jobs or who have been placed on short-term work with their tax filings, because generally in many jurisdictions you don't need to do tax filings if you are normally within the pay as you're employed service. But if you lose your job, you have to make a tax filing. So for many people, it's the first time that they have to do this tax filing, and they've just lost their jobs. They don't know how to do this or to navigate the complex structure of refunds and codes. So it's quite heartening to see one of our portfolio companies step in and help those people for free. So there are many, many examples. I could go on about our portfolio companies, but it's really very heartening to see that in a period of crisis, that Index's companies have risen up and really helped their communities and bring us closer. So very happy about that.
Thanks, Rini. Now, finally, moving on to diversity and inclusion, which, as you know, is a subject which is very close to Pantheon's heart. Venture capital has long been perceived as an industry which has lacked real diversity. What are your thoughts on diversity and inclusion in the venture capital industry, and how has Index developed its D&I policy and efforts in recent years?
Yeah, I think like across finance, diversity and inclusion is something that as an industry we all need to do better and to be mindful of. The way I see diversity and inclusion is that there are two components: diversity and inclusion. And I think that many people have different definitions or interpretations of diversity. But when I look at Index, we have so many people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different races, different gender, different nationalities, but I still feel that we can do more, and we are actually trying to do more in many respects. So something that we started internally is a diversity and inclusion task force. So we kicked this off last year, and it was a response to the Black Lives Matter protest and the Black Lives Matter movement. And one of the things that we've done is creating, this forum to participate and to create change if you want. So, of course, we did the fundraising for Black Lives Matter, and employees and the partnership contributed and raised funds, but also actually taking steps to change the environment that we're in. So this task force is working on a number of different pillars, is what we call it. So both internally in terms of how we see diversity within Index, but also externally in terms of the founders that we see, or how we engage with founders, or the events we create, or even the limited partners we take. So we have this project to complete the different pillars in the next 12 to 24 months. But one of the actions that we've already taken is that we are now internally measuring our diversity metrics. So how many people identify as a certain race or as a certain gender, and we hope to measure it again next year and track whether or not we've actually made any progress, because that's a very quantitative way of seeing how we moved from point 1 to point 2. So apart from, these diversity focused pillars, there's also this aspect of inclusion. Once we have people of different socioeconomic backgrounds or different educational backgrounds, how do you make them feel included in an organization, and how do you foster this atmosphere of zero tolerance, no harassment, all the basic stuff, but going beyond that. So that's, again, something that is always work in progress. So we have a number of, initiatives from small to basic, basic stuff like making sure that there's no pay gap between different genders, or between different departments or different geographies. So making sure that people are remunerated in accordance with their capabilities. So I think basic stuff like that, but also more wider stuff, like how do you treat someone who has to take time off to take care of someone who's sick, or who's a close family person has passed away. So we have this sickness and bereavement policy as well, which is helpful to those, especially in a year like 2020, where many people lost close ones, an extra limb of support. So it's something that we're working towards constantly, and each quarter we have something new coming up. So the team came up last quarter with a mental health support app. So it's something that we'll keep working on, but it's something that is also very close to our heart, and that's something that we hope we can only keep improving from now.
Thanks again, Rini, for your time today and for all the efforts that you're putting into ESG and diversity and inclusion. It's very much appreciated.
It's my pleasure, and thank you to all our limited partners and Pantheon also for creating this important conversation and creating this space to make sure that the industry talks about it and we keep improving as a group.